Deep in the remote Ethiopian mountains, tucked away for centuries in ancient monasteries, lies a treasure Rome never quite managed to obliterate. These are texts preserving a truth so potent, it's been silenced for nearly 2 millennia. While the Western world knows only fragments of Mary Magdalene's story, the Ethiopian Church has fiercely guarded testimonies revealing her true role in early Christianity. This isn't just another tale of religious censorship. It's the uncovering of how one of the most pivotal figures in early Christian history was deliberately scrubbed from the official narrative. The story you're about to uncover will fundamentally reshape your understanding of Christianity's origins. For decades, archaeological digs have unearthed evidence confirming what those Ethiopian texts have quietly safeguarded. Mary Magdalene wasn't just another follower of Jesus. She was a central figure whose testimony was deemed so threatening to the established power structure that it had to be purged from official records. Yet, in the highlands of Ethiopia, where Christianity arrived independently and evolved with greater freedom, these testimonies endured. These Ethiopian manuscripts, penned in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, contain detailed accounts of Mary Magdalene's teachings and role found nowhere else. Recent paleographic studies have confirmed that some of these texts trace their roots back to traditions as early as the 2nd century AD, making them extraordinarily early testimonies to the life of this crucial figure in primitive Christianity. The Ethiopian Bible, known as the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings, along with other supplementary texts, paints a radically different picture of Mary Magdalene. According to these sources, she wasn't just a close disciple of Jesus. She received special teachings and was tasked with preserving specific aspects of his message. The texts describe private encounters where Jesus shared knowledge with her that wasn't imparted to other disciples, establishing her as a figure of unique spiritual authority. Specialists in early Christian history point out that the Ethiopian tradition maintains elements systematically purged from Western canonical texts during Christianity's formative centuries. While an increasingly patriarchal ecclesiastical structure was evolving in Rome, Ethiopia preserved traditions that recognize the fundamental role of women in transmitting the original Christian teachings. Archaeological investigations in ancient Ethiopian monasteries have unearthed entire libraries that remained untouched for centuries, safeguarded by the mountainous terrain and the country's relative isolation. These repositories hold not only the primary texts, but also commentaries and interpretations that reveal a continuous line of transmission for these traditions concerning Mary Magdalene. The manuscripts describe specific episodes where Mary Magdalene acts as an intermediary between Jesus and other disciples, translating and explaining complex teachings. According to these texts, she possessed a particular understanding of Jesus' parables and symbols, making her an authorized interpreter of his message. This wasn't seen as exceptional or miraculous, but rather the result of specific spiritual preparation and receptivity. The preservation of these testimonies in Ethiopia wasn't accidental. Ethiopian Christianity developed with unique characteristics that set it apart from both Roman and Eastern Christianity. It retained elements of pre-Christian Jewish traditions and cultivated a theology that integrated mystical and contemplative aspects gradually suppressed in other Christian branches. In this fertile ground, Mary Magdalene's testimony found a place to survive and be transmitted. If you find this information revealing how the Ethiopian Church safeguarded these unique testimonies, then you'll want to hit that subscribe button to uncover more historical secrets hidden for centuries. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss any revelation that could completely shift your perspective on the history you thought you knew. To fully grasp the significance of these Ethiopian texts, it's crucial to understand the historical context in which they evolved. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia remarkably early, possibly in the 1st century, via trade routes connecting the Red Sea with the Mediterranean world. Unlike other regions where Christianity was established under the direct influence of Rome or Constantinople, Ethiopian Christianity maintained an independence that allowed it to preserve traditions deemed problematic elsewhere. Early Ethiopian Christians had access to sources later classified as apocryphal by Roman councils. Among these were Gospels and epistles containing extensive references to Mary Magdalene and her role in the early Christian community. While these texts were gradually marginalized and eventually banned in the Roman world, in Ethiopia they were incorporated into the official tradition and preserved as an integral part of Christian heritage. The Ethiopian texts depict Mary Magdalene not merely as a witness to the resurrection, but as a recipient of specific revelations concerning the nature of the heavenly kingdom and the mysteries of faith. According to these sources, she received teachings on the soul's nature, the different levels of spiritual existence, and methods for achieving mystical union with the divine. This knowledge was then passed on by her to a select circle of disciples who were charged with preserving and transmitting it to future generations. The Ethiopian tradition also preserves accounts of Mary Magdalene's activities following Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. According to these texts, she wasn't just a passive witness to events, but played an active role in organizing the early Christian communities. The manuscripts describe her traveling to different regions, establishing communities of believers, and teaching the deeper aspects of Christian doctrine. Recent research has confirmed that many elements found in the Ethiopian texts have parallels in other primitive Christian documents discovered in the 20th century, such as the Nag Hammadi texts. This convergence of independent sources strengthens the credibility of the Ethiopian traditions and suggests they preserved authentic aspects of early Christianity lost in other traditions. The richness of the Ethiopian manuscripts becomes even more apparent when we examine the specific details of the teachings Mary Magdalene shared with her followers. The texts describe a complex system of spiritual understanding that encompassed not only the basic doctrinal aspects of Christianity, but also meditative practices and methods of contemplation that allowed believers to directly experience the divine presence. These teachings included specific techniques of prayer, fasting, and spiritual retreat that Mary Magdalene had learned during her close association with Jesus, and later adapted for different types of spiritual seekers. The Ethiopian manuscripts reveal that Mary Magdalene established what we might call schools of spiritual wisdom in several cities across the eastern Mediterranean. These communities were characterized by a less hierarchical structure than those that would later develop under Roman influence, granting leadership roles to both men and women based on their spiritual development and doctrinal understanding rather than political or social criteria. The texts describe gatherings where Mary Magdalene shared mystical visions and interpretations of Jesus' parables that don't appear in the canonical Gospels, unveiling layers of meaning only comprehensible to those who had achieved a certain level of spiritual maturity. Particularly intriguing is the manuscript's description of Mary Magdalene's knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures and her ability to connect Jesus' teachings with the prophetic traditions of the Old Testament. The Ethiopian texts present her as a scholar who could extensively quote the Psalms and the prophets, using this knowledge to explain how Christian teachings represented the fulfillment of ancient messianic promises. This portrayal sharply contrasts with the more limited image of her presented in the canonical texts, where she primarily appears in the context of Christ's passion and resurrection. The manuscripts also preserve accounts of the controversies Mary Magdalene faced from some male leaders of the early Christian communities. These texts suggest significant tensions existed regarding the role women should play in community leadership, and that Mary Magdalene was an active advocate for spiritual equality between men and women. The Ethiopian documents describe theological debates where she argued that Jesus' message transcended traditional social limitations and that the capacity to receive and transmit divine revelation depended not on gender, but on the degree of inner purification and spiritual dedication. Especially revealing are the passages describing the mystical visions Mary Magdalene experienced after Jesus' ascension. According to the Ethiopian texts, she continued to receive direct revelations that complemented and deepened the teachings she had received during Christ's earthly ministry. These visions included information about the soul's nature after death, the different levels of celestial existence, and the processes of spiritual purification souls had to undergo to achieve complete union with God. The manuscripts describe these experiences with a level of detail suggesting they were meticulously documented and preserved by her direct disciples. The Ethiopian texts also contain references to correspondence between Mary Magdalene and other prominent Christian leaders of her era, including letters she wrote to communities in different cities to provide doctrinal guidance and resolve theological disputes. These letters, according to the manuscripts, circulated widely among early Christian communities and were considered authoritative by many believers. The fact that these documents were preserved in the Ethiopian tradition while seemingly vanishing from other Christian traditions strongly suggests a deliberate process of suppression in other regions. Particularly significant is the information the Ethiopian manuscripts provide regarding Mary Magdalene's teachings on the role of women in spiritual and communal life. The texts portray her arguing that women had not only the right, but also the responsibility to participate fully in religious life, including teaching and leadership roles. This perspective, apparently shared by many early Christian communities, eventually clashed with the patriarchal structures that solidified as Christianity became institutionalized under the Roman Empire. The manuscripts further describe the specific biblical interpretation techniques Mary Magdalene developed and taught her disciples. These methods included what we might describe as allegorical and mystical interpretation, where sacred texts were understood to contain multiple levels of meaning that revealed themselves progressively as the reader advanced in their spiritual development. This approach to Scripture, later developed by Christian mystics like Origen, apparently had its roots in Mary Magdalene's teachings as preserved in the Ethiopian texts. The documents also reveal information about the liturgical practices that developed in the communities established by Mary Magdalene. These included specific ceremonies commemorating both Christ's passion and resurrection, as well as the later revelations received by Mary Magdalene. The texts describe rituals incorporating elements of contemplative prayer, sacred chanting, and silent meditation, creating a liturgical experience designed to facilitate a direct encounter with the divine among participants. These practices apparently influenced the development of Christian monastic traditions, though this connection was later obscured when Mary Magdalene's teachings were marginalized. The Ethiopian manuscripts also preserve detailed narratives about the missionary journeys Mary Magdalene undertook after the events of Pentecost, revealing a much more active and prominent figure than later traditions suggested. According to these texts, she traveled extensively throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, establishing Christian communities in important cities like Ephesus, where she apparently spent several years teaching and training local leaders. The documents describe how these communities developed distinctive organizational structures that reflected Mary Magdalene's teachings on spiritual equality and communal participation. These early churches seemingly operated with a shared leadership model where both men and women could serve as elders and teachers, a practice later suppressed when more rigid hierarchical structures were established. The Ethiopian texts also contain first-hand testimonies about the teaching methods Mary Magdalene employed with her disciples. These accounts describe extensive sessions of Socratic dialogue where she guided her students through penetrating questions that led them to profound spiritual discoveries. The manuscript suggests this pedagogical method was considered revolutionary in its era, treating students as active participants in the learning process rather than passive recipients of doctrine. Particularly notable is the description of how Mary Magdalene adapted her teachings to the specific needs of each individual, recognizing that different people required different approaches for their spiritual growth. The revelations preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts also include specific teachings on the nature of mystical experience and the altered states of consciousness spiritual seekers could attain. The texts describe meditation and contemplation techniques Mary Magdalene developed, drawing both from her own visionary experiences and methods she had learned during her years of spiritual training. These practices included specific forms of conscious breathing, symbolic visualization, and prayer recitation that apparently facilitated profound states of union with the divine. The manuscripts suggest these techniques were widely practiced in early Christian communities but were later deemed suspicious by ecclesiastical authorities who preferred more controlled forms of religious expression. The Ethiopian documents further reveal fascinating information about Mary Magdalene's relationships with other prominent figures of early Christianity, including correspondence with the Apostle Paul that suggests significant differences in their theological approaches. The texts preserve fragments of letters where Mary Magdalene challenges some of Paul's interpretations regarding the role of women in Christian communities, arguing that these restrictions contradicted both Jesus' direct teachings and the example he had set by including women as full disciples. This tension, which apparently developed during Christianity's earliest decades, would eventually contribute to the marginalization of traditions associated with Mary Magdalene, as Pauline interpretations gained ascendancy in the institutional church. The manuscripts also contain narratives about the miracles and healings Mary Magdalene performed during her ministry, presenting her not only as a spiritual teacher, but also as a powerful healer who continued the therapeutic work that had characterized Jesus' ministry. The texts describe specific cases where she healed people suffering from various physical and mental ailments, using methods that combined prayer, the laying on of hands, and the use of sacred oils. These narratives suggest that Mary Magdalene had developed a sophisticated understanding of the connection between spiritual well-being and physical health, a perspective that would later influence the development of Christian healing traditions. Particularly revealing is the material preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts concerning the prophecies Mary Magdalene received during her visionary experiences, including specific warnings about how the original teachings of Christianity would be distorted as the religion became institutionalized. The texts describe visions where she foresaw the future of the Christian movement, including Christianity's adoption by the Roman Empire and the consequences this would have for doctrinal purity. These prophecies, according to the manuscripts, led her to emphasize the importance of preserving authentic teachings in communities that could maintain their independence from dominant political structures. The documents also reveal information about the ascetic practices Mary Magdalene developed and taught, including specific periods of fasting, vigil, and solitary retreat, designed to purify both body and soul in preparation for deeper spiritual experiences. The texts describe how these practices were adopted by her disciples and eventually influenced the development of early Christian monasticism, though this connection was later obscured when Mary Magdalene's contributions were minimized in official records. The Ethiopian manuscripts also preserve extraordinary testimonies about the mystical teachings Mary Magdalene developed in her later years, when she had established communities of disciples in different regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. These texts reveal that she had created a complex system of spiritual initiation that included 7 levels of understanding, each designed to lead the practitioner toward a deeper union with the divine. The documents describe specific purification rituals that combined elements of Jewish tradition with innovations Mary Magdalene had received directly through her post-resurrection visions. These rituals included ceremonial baths in blessed waters, certain lunar phases, the use of specific incenses prepared with herbs she had consecrated herself, and periods of contemplation that could stretch on for entire days. Particularly fascinating are the accounts of the mystical ecstasy Mary Magdalene regularly experienced, during which she received revelations about the nature of spiritual reality and the purpose of the human soul in the cosmos. The manuscripts describe how, during these altered states of consciousness, she traveled through different spiritual dimensions, encountering angelic beings who imparted knowledge about existence's deepest mysteries. These experiences, according to the texts, allowed her to develop a unique understanding of the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds, knowledge she later shared with her most advanced disciples through teachings that blended symbolic narrative with practical instructions for meditation and contemplative prayer. The documents also preserve evidence of the growing tensions Mary Magdalene faced from local Roman authorities, who began to view her teachings as a potential threat to the established social order. The texts describe interrogations where Roman officials attempted to force her to renounce her preaching activities, offering her protection in exchange for her silence. However, the manuscripts recount that she consistently rejected these offers, arguing that her commitment to spiritual truth transcended any political or personal considerations. This resistance eventually led her to adopt more clandestine strategies to continue her ministry, establishing secret communication networks among her various communities of followers. The texts reveal detailed information about the teaching methods Mary Magdalene employed to transmit complex spiritual knowledge, including the use of parables and allegories that concealed deeper meanings from those not yet ready to receive them. The manuscripts preserve specific examples of these coded teachings, where advanced mystical concepts were presented through seemingly simple stories about everyday life. This pedagogical technique, according to the documents, had been developed specifically to protect the more sensitive teachings from persecution, while allowing sincere disciples to gradually access deeper levels of spiritual understanding. Especially revealing are the passages that describe Mary Magdalene's prophetic visions concerning the future of Christianity, including specific warnings about how the original teachings would be gradually modified to serve political and institutional interests. The texts relate that she saw in her visions how the message of unconditional love and personal transformation would eventually be subordinated to considerations of temporal power and social control. These visions motivated her to repeatedly emphasize to her disciples the importance of maintaining the original doctrinal purity, regardless of the external pressures that might arise in the future. The manuscripts also contain fascinating descriptions of the energetic healing practices Mary Magdalene had developed. techniques that apparently combined the laying on of hands with specific visualizations and the use of crystals and precious stones that had been consecrated through special rituals. The text described documented cases where these practices resulted in healings that contemporary observers considered miraculous, including the restoration of sight to individuals born blind and the cure of diseases that physicians of the era had declared incurable. These accounts suggest that Mary Magdalene had developed a sophisticated understanding of what modern traditions might call energy medicine or holistic healing. Furthermore, the documents preserve testimonies about the initiation ceremonies Mary Magdalene performed for those disciples who had demonstrated sufficient dedication and spiritual preparation. These ceremonies, according to the texts, included symbolic death and rebirth rituals where initiates experienced temporary ego dissolution, allowing them to access expanded states of consciousness. The manuscripts describe how these processes of psychological and spiritual transformation were carefully guided by Mary Magdalene, who utilized specific breathing techniques, sacred chanting, and visualization to facilitate profound experiences of connection with the divine. During these initiation rituals, the manuscripts reveal that Mary Magdalene constantly emphasized the importance of integrating mystical experiences into daily life, teaching her disciples that true spirituality did not consist of escaping the material world, but rather transforming their relationship with it through a deep understanding of the interconnected nature of all existence. The texts describe how she developed specific techniques to help initiates maintain these expanded states of consciousness during their daily activities, allowing the wisdom gained in the rituals to become a permanent transformative force in their lives. Particularly insightful are the passages documenting Mary Magdalene's teachings on the nature of time and eternity, concepts that, according to the manuscripts, constituted the core of her spiritual philosophy. The texts suggest she had developed a sophisticated understanding of what later mystical traditions would call the eternal present, teaching that true spiritual realization consisted of transcending the linear perception of time to directly experience the timeless nature of divine consciousness. Her disciples recount experiences where, under her guidance, they managed to access states of consciousness where past, present, and future were revealed as mental constructs, concealing a more fundamental reality of eternal and immutable existence. Research into these manuscripts has also revealed fascinating information about Mary Magdalene's relationships with other spiritual traditions of her time, including documented connections with Egyptian mystical schools, Syrian Gnostic traditions, and Essene communities that had preserved ancient knowledge about spiritual transformation practices. The texts suggest that she had been recognized by the leaders of these diverse traditions as a figure of extraordinary spiritual authority, someone who had managed to synthesize and transcend the limitations of any particular doctrinal system to access universal truths underlying all authentic traditions. This capacity for integration and synthesis apparently allowed her to develop a unique pedagogical approach that incorporated elements from multiple traditions while maintaining an internal coherence based on fundamental spiritual principles. The manuscripts preserve correspondence between Mary Magdalene and various spiritual masters from different traditions, exchanges that reveal a level of theological and philosophical sophistication that utterly challenges later representations that reduced her to a marginal or secondary figure. Especially significant are the documents describing the apocalyptic visions Mary Magdalene experienced during the final years of her life, visions that, according to the texts, provided detailed information about the challenges Christianity would face in the centuries following her death. The manuscripts recount that she saw with prophetic clarity how Jesus' original teachings would be gradually modified to accommodate political considerations, how the emphasis on personal transformation would be subordinated to the construction of institutional power structures, and how the message of unconditional love would paradoxically be used to justify acts of violence and oppression. These visions motivated her to intensify her efforts to preserve the authentic teachings, establishing secret networks of disciples who committed to transmitting the original knowledge through generations, regardless of any persecutions they might face. The texts describe how she developed elaborate systems of codification and symbolism that would allow future sincere seekers to recognize and access the true teachings, even when hidden within seemingly orthodox traditions. Recent studies of these manuscripts have also revealed information about the collective healing practices Mary Magdalene performed with her communities. ceremonies where entire groups of disciples participated in rituals designed to elevate collective consciousness and create energetic fields of transformation that benefited not only the direct participants, but also the broader communities where they lived. The texts describe how these practices were based on the understanding that individual and collective consciousness were fundamentally interconnected, and that the spiritual transformation of committed individuals could catalyze positive changes on much broader scales. Descriptions of these collective rituals include details about the use of sacred music, ceremonial dance, and group visualizations that created communal experiences of transcendence, strengthening bonds among participants while connecting them with deeper dimensions of spiritual reality. Particularly impressive are the accounts of Mary Magdalene's prophetic abilities, which she developed during her years of intensive spiritual practice. These skills, according to the manuscripts, allowed her to perceive future events with extraordinary accuracy and provide specific guidance to individuals on the most beneficial paths for their spiritual and material development. The texts document numerous cases where her predictions came true exactly as she had described them, including warnings about persecutions that allowed her followers to escape dangerous situations and prophecies about opportunities that enabled them to prosper in difficult circumstances. This prophetic ability apparently also extended to the realm of healing, where she could perceive the underlying spiritual and emotional causes of physical illnesses, allowing her to develop holistic treatments that addressed both manifest symptoms and their deeper roots in energetic imbalances and unresolved psychological conflicts. The documents further reveal that Mary Magdalene had established what the texts describe as mystery schools, where she taught advanced disciples specific techniques for developing their own mystical and prophetic capacities. These training programs lasted several years and included periods of intensive retreat, specialized meditation practices, and gradual initiations into progressively deeper levels of esoteric knowledge. The manuscripts preserve detailed curricula from these schools, including the trials and evaluations students had to overcome to advance to higher levels of training, pedagogical systems that reveal a sophisticated understanding of spiritual development processes, and the necessary precautions to protect students from the inherent dangers of working with powerful energies and states of consciousness. The Ethiopian documents also preserve fascinating testimonies about Mary Magdalene's abilities to work with what the texts describe as the energies of the earth and the cosmos, skills that allowed her to channel natural forces to create changes in both the physical world and the spiritual dimensions of existence. These accounts describe how she had learned to synchronize with lunar and stellar cycles to maximize the effectiveness of her spiritual work, utilizing specific astronomical configurations as windows of opportunity to perform particularly powerful healings and facilitate profound transformations in her disciples' consciousness. The manuscripts document elaborate ceremonies she led during eclipses, solstices, and other significant celestial events, rituals that apparently could produce phenomena observers described as miraculous, but that the texts present as natural manifestations of spiritual laws Mary Magdalene had come to understand and master through decades of intensive study and practice. Particularly intriguing are the passages describing her ability to work with what the documents call the Akashic records, a concept referring to a dimension of reality where all information about past, present, and future events is stored and accessible to those who have developed the necessary perceptive skills. According to these texts, Mary Magdalene could access these records to obtain information about the past lives of people seeking her help, knowledge that allowed her to identify karmic patterns creating difficulties in their current lives and develop specific strategies to resolve them. The manuscripts include detailed cases where she used this information to help people overcome inexplicable phobias, heal difficult relationships, and discover their deeper spiritual purposes, work that apparently produced lasting transformations that continued to unfold for years after her initial interventions. The documents also reveal that Mary Magdalene had developed sophisticated techniques for what the texts describe as the transmutation of negative energies, processes that allowed her to transform traumatic experiences and destructive emotions into positive forces that could be used for spiritual growth and healing. These methods apparently included purification rituals that could cleanse not only individuals, but also physical spaces and entire communities of accumulated negative influences, work the texts describe as essential for creating environments where deep spiritual development could flourish without interference. The manuscripts document cases where entire communities experienced dramatic transformations after she performed these purification works, with significant reductions in conflicts, illnesses, and other problems that had been affecting residents for prolonged periods. Furthermore, the texts preserve detailed descriptions of Mary Magdalene's techniques for working with what the documents call the subtle energetic bodies, complex energy systems that, according to these accounts, exist in parallel with the physical body and profoundly influence people's health, emotions, and spiritual capacities. The manuscripts describe how she could perceive these energetic bodies directly and identify blockages, imbalances, and damage that were creating problems in people's lives, knowledge that allowed her to develop specific treatments addressing the underlying energetic causes of manifest difficulties. These treatments apparently included techniques of laying on of hands, the use of specific crystals and stones, and the application of essential oils prepared according to formulas the texts indicate she had received through direct mystical revelations. The Ethiopian documents also reveal that Mary Magdalene had established what the texts describe as healing sanctuaries in multiple locations, sacred spaces designed specifically to facilitate processes of spiritual transformation and physical healing. These sanctuaries were apparently constructed according to specific geomantic principles, located at points where the Earth's natural energies were particularly powerful and architecturally configured to amplify and focus these forces in a way that benefited all who visited them. The manuscripts include detailed descriptions of the sacred architecture of these spaces, including the use of specific mathematical proportions, orientation towards particular stellar configurations, and the incorporation of natural elements such as springs, sacred trees, and rock formations that contributed to the energetic potency of the sites. The texts also document the methodologies Mary Magdalene utilized to train others in developing capabilities similar to her own, training programs that apparently required not only the learning of specific techniques, but also profound transformations in the students' personalities and character. The manuscripts describe how she had developed sophisticated evaluation systems to determine when disciples were prepared to receive more advanced levels of training, criteria that included not only technical mastery, but also the demonstration of qualities such as genuine compassion, authentic humility, and unwavering commitment to selfless service. The documents reveal that many of her students eventually established their own teaching and healing centers, creating networks of practitioners who continued to develop and transmit her methods for centuries after her physical departure. Particularly fascinating are the passages describing Mary Magdalene's abilities to work with what the texts call the parallel dimensions of reality, skills that allowed her to access planes of existence where it was possible to obtain knowledge and resources not available in ordinary physical reality. The manuscript suggests that she used these capabilities to receive direct teachings from advanced spiritual masters existing in these other dimensions, knowledge she then adapted and transmitted to her disciples in ways they could understand and apply in their own lives. The documents include descriptions of specific rituals she used to facilitate these interdimensional contacts, ceremonies that apparently required extensive preparations and careful precautions to protect both herself and her disciples from the potential dangers inherent in this type of advanced spiritual work. The texts further reveal that Mary Magdalene had developed unique methods for what the documents describe as transgenerational healing, techniques that could resolve not only the problems of specific individuals, but also problematic patterns that had been affecting families and lineages for multiple generations. The manuscripts document cases where she worked with people whose ancestors had experienced significant traumas or had participated in activities that had created what the texts describe as karmic debts, situations where the consequences of past actions continued to manifest as difficulties in the lives of descendants who had no conscious awareness of the root causes of their struggles. Her methods for addressing these situations apparently included reconciliation rituals, designed to heal these ancestral wounds and free future generations from the continuation of destructive patterns. The documents also preserve accounts of Mary Magdalene's unique prophetic abilities, particularly concerning what the texts describe as times of great transformation. These were identified as periods in human history when fundamental shifts in collective consciousness would open doors for both significant spiritual breakthroughs and potentially destructive crises. The manuscript suggests she received detailed visions of future events, profound implications for humanity's spiritual evolution among them. This included prophecies about the eventual rediscovery of lost teachings and the emergence of new spiritual teachers, individuals who would carry on her work, adapting it for the needs and capacities of future generations. These prophetic texts, it seems, offered specific guidance on how individuals and communities might prepare to successfully navigate these intense periods of change, seizing opportunities while sidestepping the inherent dangers of accelerated transformation. These Ethiopian manuscripts culminate with extraordinary passages detailing Mary Magdalene's final years. During these periods, she reportedly achieved levels of spiritual realization that the texts describe as rivaling those of humanity's greatest historical masters. The documents suggest that in these twilight years, she transcended the ordinary limitations of physical existence in ways that allowed her to manifest abilities her contemporaries deemed impossible. This included the power to be simultaneously present in multiple locations, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and facilitate instant healings that defied all medical understanding of her era. The texts clarify that these extraordinary powers were not ends in themselves. Rather, they were tools she utilized to more effectively serve those who sought her help. Natural manifestations of a love and compassion that had grown to encompass not just specific individuals, but all of humanity, and indeed every form of life on Earth. What makes these Ethiopian accounts particularly significant is how they lay bare not only Mary Magdalene's extraordinary capabilities, but also the specific methods she developed to cultivate and deploy these skills. Critically, she used them to benefit others without fostering dependency or power imbalances. The documents explicitly show her objective was never to impress or control. Instead, it was to empower others to develop their own latent abilities and forge their unique paths towards spiritual realization. This steadfast orientation toward selfless service and the empowerment of others represents an invaluable contribution to our understanding of how authentic spiritual development can manifest in ways that enrich not just the practitioner's life, but also the lives of all who encounter its transformative influence.